Hi, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to take development one step further, and we're going to discuss something called the integral model. And we're going to end the lecture by talking about the 5-star model that I mentioned last week. If you remember where we left off, we were talking about worldviews, and we said worldviews are the way people make meaning of the world. They're their mental models. Everyone has a mental model based on a particular lens. The lens really is based on historical perspective or our historical exposure to different things, our education level, good, bad, things that have happened to us at the past in terms of experiences. All of these things shape our mental models. Now, when we talked about development, if you remember, I said Bob Keegan says that development is when the subject of one level of development becomes the object of the next. So in essence, it's this expanding of our worldviews. Elliot Jock actually is a business leader who actually has published an interesting book, The Executive Leader, that actually talks about how developmental levels play a role in people progressing through organizations and shows the skill levels that develop along the way that are necessary to be a senior leader of an organization. Now, with this, when we talk about the subject of one area becoming the object of the next, what are we talking about? We need to look at that in a little more depth. So let's think about that for a moment. When you look at any situation, there's 4 given ways, 4 different dimensions that you can utilize to view any situation. This really goes all the way back to the time of Plato, when Plato's theory of form considered 3 different aspects or 3 different views or dimensions of any situation: the good, the true, and the beautiful. It continues today. Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher, actually created validity claims for Plato's forms, and they kind of match up this way. When we're talking about the beautiful, we're really talking about truthfulness. In other words, are we truthful to ourselves in terms of what we think or feel? When we talk about truth, we're talking about, is it really true? Is there empirical truth, such as it's raining outside? When we talk about good, we're talking about justness. Justness in the terms of different individuals, groups of individuals, the collective feeling like something is correct or right or good. Now, if you go a step further, you can actually take and look at language. In terms of language, every language has these three components. It has I, we, or you, and it. The I being the individual perspective, the we being the collective perspective. Sometimes we think of that as you, and really it becomes we when we understand each other, but otherwise it's just the plural you. And it, in terms of the third person, the other, the empirical, the object we're talking about. Now, if we look at these in a little more depth, if you think about it from the individual perspective, we have specific bodies of academic study, such as psychology and social psychology, that look at how individuals think, how they feel, what they perceive. From the collective perspective, we have individual or we have group processes or academic bodies of studies, such as social psychology and sociology, that looks at how the collective or the group feels. Also, we have this whole area in terms of business that we deal with a lot, in terms of culture and thinking about business culture. Edgar Schein has spent his entire career at Harvard looking at organizational culture and looking at how it can be changed, or looking at how we can understand it better such that we can accomplish things in organizations. So we'll talk about that more as we go through. There's the empirical piece, the empirical sciences, everything we can measure. It's the empirical truth again, such as it's raining outside or it's not. Or we made $5,000 in revenue in a given day. Those are empirical things that we can measure, we can count, we can evaluate. And these things are important. Now, if you look at education in general, and much of your education, what your exposure is to, right, you're probably learning a lot about empirical pieces. You're learning about looking at things in more and more depth. Our research project is an example. I've asked you to take some subject and look at it in greater depth. So the tendency is to fragment, to look at smaller and smaller pieces, scope it down, look at, if you understand how the individual pieces work, the thought is that you'll understand the collective better. However, intuitively, it doesn't always make sense. People are very poor intuitive scientists. People are very inaccurate about how they predict things. As an example, working as a consultant, if I asked a group of employees the busiest time of the day or the busiest time in their 24-hour, 168-hour week, quite often they're not correct, because what they remember is the last day that they worked, that it was particularly busy. So that's what they'll report. Or if I ask people about performance in terms of skills, or in terms of cost, or in terms of revenue, or how often they do a procedure, any of those empirical pieces, people are very poor at intuiting them quite often. The other thing they really are poor at in terms of individuals and groups from the subjective perspective is putting these pieces together and seeing how they interact with each other. So for that reason, people like Russell Ackoff at the Wharton Business School have created system science. System science is where we actually take and we try to understand how it's not just the parts, but it's the wholes that are important also. All essential parts are always connected in some way, and they play a role in the final outcomes. So it's taking those pieces, understanding them by defragmenting, but then putting them back together in a way that we can better understand the whole. This was really popularized by Peter Senge in his books, The Fifth Discipline and The Fifth Discipline Field Book, where he kind of laid out 5 important components to system mastery, which were personal mastery, mental models as we discussed, having a shared vision, team learning, and systems thinking itself. If you go a step further, back in the mid-50s, a gentleman by the name of J. Forrester at MIT actually founded system dynamics, which is really where systems thinking began. And with system dynamics, we actually take and utilize this information in a systems model. So where you may conduct a research project in your research class, or for this class, and you're looking at an input and how it affects an output, in a systems dynamic model, we would look at how a series of inputs create over a period of time a system of outputs and how they interact with each other such that the output actually affects the input in the future and such that it's a continuous process. And it's very interesting because these system dynamic models have been shown to be very helpful in terms of policy decisions and looking at things like low-income employment rates, outcomes in business, looking at social welfare projects and what the outcomes will be over the longer term. All of these things have been helped along by system dynamics. Now, if you're interested in system dynamics, one of the best books is by this gentleman, John Sterman, who's at MIT also now. He was a student of Jay Forrester's and is really the head of the system dynamics program there at MIT now. But he has a book, Business Dynamics. And if you search around, you can probably find it at a discount rate. Definitely not an easy one-night read. It's a pretty long book, but very interesting reading and very educational in terms of teaching you how to put models together. Ironically, system dynamics has recently come into the clinical realm, and people realize that if we're looking at something such as cardiac resuscitation, for example, we have to ask the question, why have we never considered the system's perspective on cardiac resuscitation? Because when you look at the system, all of these pieces have to fit together in some way. And they really do. Your response times, your ability to maintain your fleet, the ability to have materials management that supplies the supplies you need, all of those things in some way contribute to your cardiac resuscitation rates. If we look more specifically at the physiology of cardiac resuscitation, blood flow affects, cellular metabolism in terms of depolarization, repolarization, movement of sodium and potassium, and without ATP, that can't revert back. The cells can't repolarize. It very much is it's not an active process. It's a passive process by which we defibrillate patients and hopefully resuscitate them by clearing out the VFib, by depolarizing the cells and hoping there's enough energy there, enough ATP left at the cellular level for the cells to repolarize. So we started thinking maybe we should look at a model in terms of this and how all these pieces fit together. Well, the Wharton School was actually hired to work with a lot of cardiac resuscitation researchers. And they're in the process of trying to develop a system dynamic model now for cardiac resuscitation. Here's an example of an EMS model. So you can see how the feedback loops work of the individual components affecting each other, such that each are both an input and an output, which really fits well with something called holonic theory. And if you're interested in that, I can point you to some references, but that's a little deeper than I want to go in this lecture. Well, how this comes together in terms of what I mentioned, the name of the lecture, the integral model, is something called the integral model, which is the 4 quadrants. It's the individual and the collective of the subjective and the objective. So you have I, we, it, and its. Its being the systems component. That's where, if you think about the good, the true, and the beautiful, the true is actually split out into both an individual and a collective truth to make the 4 quadrants. So you can see how these fit together. We have the subjective, the objective, and we have the individual and the collective. And anything you look at can be viewed from those 4 dimensions. The integral model is actually gaining a tremendous amount of interest and is being used in the business environment. There's actually an integral evidence-based model or integral model of evidence for emergency medicine. A physician in Canada actually came up with that some time back. And you can see how it's a much wider model than simply looking at one piece, such as empirical truth, in that we're taking into consideration other things, such as the culture that's involved and the individual thought processes, and systematically how all these pieces fit together. So here you can see just another list of how that kind of spans out and all the components of it. If we're looking at the subjective collective piece, we're talking about, again, the culture, the shared visions that exist, the mission, the values, how those things play together. And sometimes you'll find a culture that is very different as a collective than individual thought processes in an organization. Same with the empirical piece. You may find empirical individual aspects that perform well, but when you look at it collectively, that's not the case. And we'll actually look at this later when we look at some of the logistics of deployment and inventory systems. And one of the things you'll see is that if you take the average performance, which is commonly done and is used in some very bad ways in terms of measurement, in terms of dashboards and scorecards, but if you take that individual measure of performance, the average, and let's say we have 3 components, and we take and we add the average of those 3 components. The average of those 3 components, those 3 sub-processes that add up to the whole process, together, aggregately, they will not equal the sum of those 3 numbers added together. It will always be more, because the component that's left out is the component of variation. So we'll talk about that because that becomes very important. So you can see how we have individual performance and the collective performance, and how those things work together. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up in the next lecture talking about business models, and specifically the 5-star model that we're going to utilize in the class.